this is the headquarters of the global financial weapons of mass destruction manufacturing business. And that's why we've come, to find out what the frick is going on. Stacey Herbert, talk to me.
This episode is going to be dedicated to the notion of déjà fraud, because you must have felt that standing in front of UBS. Anywhere there's a banker wielding a derivative, there is déjà fraud happening. Now, this concept of déjà fraud was introduced by Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst, and he just wrote a letter, an open letter to President Obama about the Syria situation. And he referred to Obama's use of a government assessment being sold as an intelligence summary. And he said this is déjà fraud. It's like the Downing Street memo, where Tony Blair ignored the advice of Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6, and just presented a sexed-up dossier, let's call it.
Right. Well, selective amnesia is something that was reliable for years, where the population could be counted on to forget anything that happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But thanks to alternative media and the internet, everything is online, being referenced and being shouted about by screaming bloggers and podcasters. And of course, this show is a big contributing factor to how those who want to believe that the current situation is not just recooked fraud, intelligence fraud, again, are finding it difficult. And this, to me, this smells like the Richard Nixon era, which I'll go into detail with that at some point. But I get where you're going with this. So,
well, we're 5 years into the financial collapse, 5 years since Lehman Brothers collapsed, and Lehman Brothers collapsed due to a déjà fraud of Repo 105. Repo 105 was what caused Enron to collapse, and then a few years later, Lehman Brothers to collapse. 5 years later, USA Today is asking, 2008 financial crisis, could it happen again? And they're also asking, well, they're also saying, we should be worried. Why, Max? Because repackaging of debt is back.
Right, this Repo 105 you talked about, going back to Lehman Brothers and the other scandals of the past 5 years, 10 years, it goes back to understanding that banks, essentially, when they say they've got something on their books, they don't really have anything on their books. In fact, they've loaned out that thing that they say they have on their books to another bank that has, in fact, lent it out to some other bank. And it goes around in this daisy chain of fraud, or déjà fraud, or a circle of fraud. And the problem with the 2008-2009 crisis is that there was no reform. There was no bank reform. Nobody went to jail, as people understand. And so you have not only the situation getting worse, as our guest in the second half will talk about, I'm sure, but you've got the potential for a much worse situation developing because of the leverage that's continuing to build, you know, under like a volcano in the system.
Yes, I'm going to get back to that repackaging of debt that's going to cause some more déjà fraud, presumably quite soon in the future. Now, I also want to look at this headline from the UK, which is Alistair Darling interview. Britain was 2 hours away from total social collapse. Former Chancellor on the crisis that erupted 5 years ago this week said. So here's the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Alistair Darling. And again, this is just like these going back to the Tony Blair era, where we were 45 minutes away from Saddam Hussein nuking us and wiping us away. And here we have what? Reminder of Alistair Darling saying we were 2 hours away from societal collapse. Over in the U.S., we had Hank Paulson, former Goldman Sachs CEO, saying that there would be revolution on the streets if you guys didn't pass TARP. So, déjà fraud.
What's sad about the Alistair Darling quote, that the world was 2 hours away from a massive meltdown, that what's sad about that quote is what really we should understand is that we were 2 hours away from having some accountability in the banking sector.
Exactly.
We were 2 hours away from having honest accounting. Yeah. We were 2 hours away from getting rid of the bad actors and the massive fraud in Wall Street and the City of London. We were only 2 hours away from having an economy get rid of all these crooks and then regenerate itself, which would have started, we would be right now in an honest recovery with real jobs and real GDP growth, instead of this hyper-levered chimera of an economy that's set to blow once again.
Exactly, because we are stuck on a loop, which is why we keep on having déjà fraud. We're stuck on the loop. It keeps on happening over and over. And had we had the societal collapse that he threatened, it would have ended that loop and we could have started something new. Now, I know you were also in front of RBS down in Stanford. You saw that. And he said that was the scariest moment, was when the chairman of RBS called him and said, all the money is leaving the bank. The system is collapsing. What are you going to do about it? And Alistair Darling said, that was the scariest moment. He wanted me to do something about it.
Right. Well, once again, RBS, just one of the four horsemen of the British financial apocalypse that has been allowed to